Welcome back, guys. We're going to read chapter 4 of Cracker, the Best Dog in Vietnam by Cynthia Kadohata. We started out, yesterday we read a couple chapters, but when we stopped reading chapter 3, Cracker had arrived at the training camp, and she was at Lackland Air Force Base, and she was pretty much running the show. And at one point, the trainers were trying to get her to even let them pet her or anything. And she was just busy being angry and wondering what was going on, where Willie was, and why he wasn't coming back or wasn't with her, whatever. And anyway, the last thing that we read in chapter 3 was the guys making bets on whether she was in her kennel, and they were making bets on whether she would make it or not as a military dog. And they said she was too mean because she was so angry. There's a couple of dogs that are there that she likes, and she's got this spot on her paw that she's licked so much that it's raw, because that's stressed out and worried. And she started it back when they were living in the apartment with Willie in Chicago, and she has continued to do that. And I've heard of dogs doing that, stressing out. Um, as a result of their stress. I don't know if any of you guys have ever had pets to do that. But I was going to show you Lackland Air Force Base. Let's see what it says. It's called Joint Base. It's in San Antonio. Let's see if I can pull up a picture of it. Of Lackland Air Force Base. Let's go back. Let's see if we can do images. Good old Google Maps. It shows you where Lackland Air Force Base is in San Antonio, Texas. My brother was in the Air Force in the 80s, and he was stationed there for a while. But anyway, this is where they've taken her for training. I'm really kind of surprised you can see it from the air. Looks like it would be secretive. But yeah, it's in San Antonio, Texas, where she is for her training. But anyway, all right, let's get on with it. Chapter 4 is kind of a long chapter, so it may take us a while. All right, chapter 4. Now we're introducing a new character, Rick Hanski. Rick Hanski was going to whip the world. It was just a feeling he had. He hadn't done much to back up this idea, but he just knew it. He'd signed up for the Army on his 17th birthday after a long talk with his parents and grandparents about his future and about his father's hardware store, and who might take it over someday, if not him. His parents were first-generation Scandinavian Americans. All 4 of his grandparents came from the tundra. After he'd moved to Wisconsin, Grandpa Hanski had gotten a patent for a bar clamp and sold the patent to a big tool company. He'd used the money to start a hardware store that Rick's father had inherited when Grandpa retired early. Rick had worked at the store since he was a kid. When he wanted to relax, he liked to make things. He'd made quite a few frames for his mother and a couple of chairs for his father. He liked to shape things, but he knew his work wasn't good enough to sell, and anyway, Making stuff was mostly just for relaxing. It took his mind off of what worries he had. He guessed his biggest worry was that he wasn't sure that he wanted to take over the hardware store someday. Everybody had assumed that the store was his future. That's why his parents didn't complain about his so grades. They were just proud that he worked hard in the store, and they'd never made him feel bad that his sister Amy was a math prodigy who graduated from MIT a couple of years ago and was now going for her PhD in applied mathematics, wherever that meant. He did overhear his father saying once that his sister had a calling, whereas Rick was a good, strong, well mannered boy, just like all the Hanski men had been at his age. When his father had met one of the actual DeWalts at a convention once, he talked about it for days, as if he'd met the president or something. But sometimes, working at the hardware store, Rick felt not bored exactly, but like something wasn't quite right. And Rick was filled with guilt because he knew how proud his father was of the store, but it just didn't feel right for him. So when Rick turned 17, he thought he'd sign up like some of the other local guys. He was a man now, not a boy, no matter what his parents thought. He made the announcement at dinner the week before he turned 17. Everyone had just finished eating. Rick had turned to his father, who Rick could tell was just about to stand up. Dad, I'd like to sign up. Sign up for what? Rick had felt 4 sets of eyes burn into him, his parents and his grandparents. They'd probably been thinking dinner was over and it was time to watch television, maybe laugh at a TV comedy. Life didn't hold too many surprises in the Hanski household. Sign up for Vietnam, but I need you to approve since I'll only be 17. Rick felt his own chest heaving with nervousness, but kept his eyes trained on his father's. Then everybody was talking at once. His parents and his grandparents grilled him for hours. He'd prepared for all of this and had planned to start out by talking about something he'd done once, save a kid's life. It was a couple of years ago, and he'd been standing on a sidewalk and seen a 6-year-old boy run into the path of an oncoming bus. Rick had pushed the boy out of the way and just managed to get out of the way himself. Those moments stood out with clarity in Rick's mind, whereas every day at the hardware store dulled in comparison. That's what he'd wanted to talk about that night, but instead, his family had hardly given him a chance to speak. They lectured him about what he planned to do when he got back, about whether he really understood that war was an ugly thing, as his grandfather said over and over again. Grandpa had lived in Finland during World War II, and he knew war. I know, Grandpa, Rick started to say, but then his grandmother broke in. If we'd pushed him more in school, maybe none of this would be happening, Grandma Hanski had said. If they'd pushed him in school, she continued, maybe he'd want to go to college and be an accountant for the hardware store or something. Finally, at the end of the 4 hours, silence fell and everybody turned to Rick's father. His father was a serious man who surprised you sometimes with a practical joke or a belly laugh, but there had been no joking at the table for those 4 hours. His father had leaned his forehead on his fingertips in deep thought. Then he raised his head and nodded and said, "You do what you have to do." His father came with him to sign the papers, and the Saturday before Rick left, his family threw a big party. A lot of his friends were also customers, farmers, furniture makers, factory workers. A couple of the old men had played saws with violin bows. Lots of laughing, a little crying. And now Rick Hanski was going to whip the world. That's what he thought to himself as he walked across the lush grass at Fort Benning. He'd always been self-confident. Working with your tools did that to you, made you see how you could shape things. He had to admit that so far he hadn't been a resounding success in the Army. He'd gotten written up during basic training for lack of tact and diplomacy. Apparently, some of the mucky mucks thought he was too outspoken. Originally, what had happened was that a sergeant had demanded a loan of $10 for a poker game. Demanded it. Rick had said politely, "I'm sorry, don't have it, Sarge." The next time the sergeant saw him, he demanded $10 again, and that had just offended Rick's sense of fairness. In the house, in which he'd been raised. The world was a fair place. Maybe Rick had always been a bit of a firebrand, got that from his mother's father. His mother said it wasn't a bad temper, it was righteous indignation, whatever that was. It didn't get you far in the army. Then, in advanced infantry training, Rick had gotten into a couple of fistfights, more righteous indignation. That got him written up. Rick had to admit that a couple of times he laid on a cot and wondered whether he'd made a mistake by signing up. He was proud of his sister. Maybe her brains were part of the problem. Rick didn't like to admit that. He wasn't jealous, really. He was proud of her. He just smarted a little from it all. He still remembered something a math teacher told him. This was way back in 7th grade, as he was leaving class with a C- on a test. His teacher had said, "You're a generalist, Richard. Some people like your sister are born to be specialists. Others are born to be generalists, even if they apply themselves, which you don't." Actually, he'd studied hard for that test, and then his teacher had mussed his hair. "You're a nice boy." She was an old lady, must have been about 55 at least. He'd been self-confident even then, but something about the word generalist got to him and bothered him still. At that time, that righteous indignation had risen up in him, and he'd said coolly, "Can I go now, ma'am?" Saving that boy's life was the one resounding success of Rick's life, and he wasn't sure what apply yourself meant. It sounded like gluing yourself to drywall or something. Anyway, despite the bad write-ups in his file and his friend's older brother, who'd flown through officer candidate school the previous year and also happened to be good friends with the man in charge of dog handler training, had put in a good word for Rick, and he was offered the chance to become a dog handler in Vietnam. There was a shortage of dog handlers, and they were in demand. Becoming a dog handler meant extra training, and the more training you had, the longer it would take you to get to Nam for your year-long tour in country. Originally, Rick had wanted to get in country as soon as possible, but he decided that while he still planned to whip the world, there was nothing wrong with delaying the timing. So Rick figured he would still whip the world, but with a dog at his side. Although he was one of the few families in the community without a dog, all his friends owned dogs, and Rick had always liked them fine. He walked across the field toward the kennels. The humidity felt like a hand or somebody with a fever hovering very close to his face, but not quite touching it. A lot of guys were complaining about the unusually hot weather. But the way Rick figured it, if a little humidity could stop you from whipping the world, well, you might as well be a bookkeeper for a hardware store. He'd just been assigned the dog he would train with. The Sarge had snickered when he assigned Rick to supposedly one of the biggest and apparently meanest dogs in the kennel. She had tussled with or bitten several personnel already. Rick knew the Sarge didn't like him because of the aforementioned lack of tact and diplomacy recorded in his file. Sometimes Rick wondered whether he should have listened to his uncle in California. When his uncle had heard Rick wanted to join the army, he had offered to take Rick in and turn him into a master carpenter. But you weren't going to save any lives by pounding nails. Rick stopped in front of the cage reading Cracker. She was big, but she looked docile enough, lying there on the concrete with her front paws delicately crossed. Rick didn't feel a lick of fear. Her kennel was next to Tristy's, one of the 2 dogs everybody somehow knew were already excellently trained. Rick knew that Tristy had been assigned a handler named 20/20. He actually had 20/40 vision, but he had this weird habit of always doing eye exercises, rolling his eyes around and moving them left and right as far as he could. Then he would lie on the ground with his palms covering his eyes. Some of the guys thought he was nuts, especially since he was black, and people didn't talk or act the way some people think black people should. But Rick thought he was okay. He stopped to pat Tristy. Tristy was unnaturally skinny. You could see her ribs sticking out, but very energetic and smart. She must have weighed less than half of what Cracker weighed, but Rick would have liked pulling her. He didn't open Cracker's cage just yet. He looked at the rows of German Shepherds and Shepherd mixes. Apparently, Fort Benning, Georgia, housed hundreds of potential scout dogs. This row housed the dogs who would be traveling to Vietnam with this platoon. All these dogs at Benning and he pulled the one with attitude. Rick wondered where the other dogs were housed. He'd heard Fort Benning was almost as big as New York City's 5 boroughs, but Rick had no idea what shape it was. As a matter of fact, he didn't even know what a borough was. Fort Benning was a center of Army training. Among other things, it housed Officer Candidate School, Jump or Parachute School, Basic Training, and Special Forces. Rick just leaned on the cage, thinking idly about Jump School. Cracker didn't even move her eyes as the man laid a palm on her gate, but she growled, still without looking at him. Cracker, he said. Hey, girl, Cracker. Cracker listened to him but didn't move her head. Finally, she moved just her eyes in his direction. He reached a forefinger in and wiggled it. Obviously an idiot. She didn't bother to raise her head. He started to open the gate while she lay still but tensed slightly. Then he cracked the gate open, a touch, and she lunged. He slammed the gate shut as her body hit the wire. Though he stood safely outside the gate, he took a step back. That seemed to satisfy her a bit. But she didn't move from the gate. Wow, what was her problem? Rick had never seen a dog move so fast. He noticed that some guys had gathered at the end of the kennels watching him. He hoped he looked convincingly nonchalant. So nonchalant means cool. Okay. So now he's trying to make a connection with Cracker and she's not having it. All right. So maybe it would be a little tougher than he thought. But she was just a dog, right? He was a human. He was superior, right? He reached into his pocket and took out his secret weapon, a wiener. Wiener. I'm going to say hot dog, he said in a low voice. According to the manual, men weren't supposed to give the dogs treats. First of all, the dogs needed to stay lean and muscular for the hard work they'd be doing in Vietnam. Second of all, dogs were supposed to follow their handler's directions out of love for the person, not out of love for treats. But this was a special situation. He saw Cracker eyeing the hot dog. Hot dog, he said again. Cracker paused. She knew the word hot dog. Willie had used that word. She hadn't seen Willie for a long time, but she remembered him, the way he smelled, the way he breathed, the way his arms felt wrapped around her. She also remembered hot dogs. Hot dogs smell good, very good. She stopped growling, but didn't relax her body. Hot dog for Cracker. Everybody in the world seemed to know her name. Even this man with a hot dog. He opened the gate very slowly, broke off a piece of hot dog. Cracker growled. What did this man want? He threw her a piece of the hot dog. She let it fall to the ground before sniffing it suspiciously, keeping her eyes on the man the whole time. Then she snapped up the meat and hopped backward. The man didn't move. Good hot dog. Not that she'd ever tasted a bad one. Hot dog? The man said. Another hot dog for Cracker? Hot dog for Cracker. He pushed the gate open farther. She moved back rather than lunging, but she stayed poised for lunging. She didn't growl, however. The man opened his hand, and inside was another small piece of hot dog. She stood still, but wouldn't move toward him. He sat down in the doorway. Okay, have it your way, he said, and he laid the hot dog bit on the ground before him. She just sat and looked at him, not at the hot dog. He laid another piece of hot dog down. She lunged suddenly, causing him to scramble up. But she wasn't lunging for him. She snapped up the 2 hot dog bits. Then she stood, growling, her whole body tense, in case she needed to rip his face off. Rick's heart was pounding. She was like a cat. He considered himself pretty quick, yet she'd caught him by surprise. Still, he knew she could have bitten him if she'd wanted to. So she must have made some progress. He held out his open palms, and she sniffed his hands. She sat. Sitting was a universal language for, I'll take another hot dog. She stiffened as he moved his fingers under her chin. What was the point of that? Then he moved his hand up and scratched behind her ear. Good girl. He patted his own head. Rick. Good girl. He scratched her other ear. Cracker liked good girl. When Willie said it, it was even better than hot dog, though not by much. She missed good girl, thinking of Willie made her whine. The man's hands were firmer and bigger than Willie's, and his smell was stronger, sweatier, but he smelled okay. He rubbed her head in a new way that she liked. pressing all of his fingers at once into her skull. He did this for quite a while he said, "Good girl," and left. Rick stepped outside, mentally patting himself on the back. He was still going to whip the world, no doubt about it. Another man, a tall, friendly guy named Cody Willis, leaned toward Cracker's kennel and said, "Good girl." "Hey, you're not supposed to do that," Rick said. "Do what?" "Once you get a dog, you're only supposed to praise your own dog. Nobody can praise anybody else's dog. It's in the manual." The dogs were supposed to bond with one man and one man only. On the other hand, the manual also said that if a dog's handler got wounded, sometimes the dogs felt protective of their handler, so protective that they wouldn't let the medic near enough to help. In that case, someone was supposed to shoot the dog. So it was good for the dog to at least be able to tolerate someone else besides the handler. Cody shrugged good naturedly. "Okay, man." He gestured toward the huge, calm dog. "I pulled Bruno." That feeling passed through Rick. That feeling of smarting that he got every so often when people talked about what a genius sister his sister was. Not, ev- Not envy, though, just stinging sensation. Everybody knew that Bruno was a smart, strong dog, and friendly, too. Some of the guys had taken him out and found he was perfectly trained already. He was older than the others, 4.5 years old, but apparently such a good dog that the Army had kept him. In fact, Bruno had almost been stationed at Lockland because one of the captains had taken a shine to him. But the captain had gotten appendicitis, and Bruno ended up here after all to get assigned to some teacher's pet like Cody. Rick leaned in toward Cracker. "Remember, Rick." He started walking away, but the Hanski good manners kicked in, and he turned and said to Cody, "Bruno's a great dog. Congratulations," and then left. Cracker sat at the gate as the man walked away. She liked a good girl, and the man was okay, but he'd forgotten to give her the rest of the hot dog. Tristy came to the fence and sniffed at her. That night, as the moon rose over the trees in the distance, Cracker actually lifted her head every so often when she heard an unusual sound, and a couple of times she sniffed the air with interest. She hadn't felt interested in smells or sounds for a long time. They seemed a little more intriguing tonight, but she still felt a hurt inside of herself that wouldn't go away. A huge bird sailed across the sky, and she barked at it. A number of other dogs also barked. Wow, Cracker had forgotten how good it felt to bark at a bird like that. She stretched her muscles and looked around, and then paced back and forth a few times before settling down for bed. She slept intermittently through the night, occasionally hearing what sounded like firecrackers in the distance. She knew what firecrackers were because Willie had taken her to the park a few times to watch them exploding lights in the sky. She heard firecracker noises many times since she'd been in this cage, but tonight, for some reason, she raised her ears and sniffed the air. In the morning, the man with the strong hand showed up again, this time with dog food. She could smell him coming before she could see him. When he arrived, he opened the gate and set down the food. She paused for just a moment. "What? No hot dog?" It didn't appear, so she ate the food. "Not bad." "I'm Rick," said the man. He scratched her and said, "Good girl," a few times. He looked at the inside of her ear and said, 72AO. "That's your number. I got a number too on my dog tag. I don't need a tattoo in my ear like you." He'd heard that a lot of good handlers talked to their dogs kind of like they were people. It felt a little peculiar, but she seemed to like it. "Woof," she said. She sent the thought at him, "Give me a hot dog." She sat, and there it was in his hand, a piece of hot dog. She gobbled it up. He lowered his voice. "We're not supposed to give you treats. Don't tell anyone. Good girl. Come." Then he pulled the chain around her throat, choking her a bit. She growled and tensed. She might need to rip his face off after all. She saw the other men pulling their dogs. One dog dragged all four of his paws on the ground as the man holding his leash kept saying, "Heel, no, heel." Cracker tried to tug in the opposite direction, but Rick jerked the chain firmly. "No," he said. She knew no, but she never heard it said quite so firmly before. Willie's father said it angrily sometimes, and Willie said it lovingly, like he didn't mean it. Rick said it firmly, and he meant it. Rick walked her along with the other dogs, but she didn't heel. She either lagged behind or pulled. A slight drizzle fell on them, and Rick saw Cody jerk expertly at Bruno's leash and say, heel. Bruno heeled perfectly at Cody's side. Rick said, heel, and Cracker sat down instead. Rick said to Cody, I don't think this dog's going to learn so easy. Cody turned to Rick and said, want me to give it a try? Cody, okay, but it won't make a difference. Rick knew dogs, even if he never had one. He'd been around them all his life. Cody handed Bruno's leash to Rick. Bruno sat patiently. What a dog. Rick felt that sting again. Then he watched Cody slap his left leg, step out with his left leg, and snap, heel, to Cracker. Cracker heeled perfectly, even when Cody went in circles or trotted. They trotted back, and Cody and Rick traded leashes. She's already trained, Cody said, and very well. Okay, when they say heel, guys, they're talking about the dog just walking along beside of you, pace for pace, even with you. So if you've got a leash on the dog, then the leash won't be pulled tight. The leash will just be hanging slack in between you because the dog keeps up with you and walks beside you evenly. It's not lagging behind. It's not pulling ahead. That's what they were talking about. Rick looked at Cracker and mumbled, okay, no more games. Rick and Matt imitated Cody, but Cracker started to drag her legs like the other dogs had, so he had no choice but to drag her to formation like a fool. Cody walked beside them with Bruno, the Mr. Universe of dogs. Cody half grinned the whole time. He was 6'4", a full foot taller than Rick, but weighed only about 3 pounds more. He liked to say he was the skinniest man in Minnesota. Cody's eyes were the blue of a lighter flame, his expression gullible. He had a slight overbite. He was the most cheerful man Rick had ever met. His smile was everything. He smiled about everything, especially eating. Rick was happy enough guy, but he certainly wasn't cheerful. Cheerful was, well, not really in keeping with the Hanski idea of manhood. Certainly Rick believed that the cup was always half full, but this guy seemed to think it was overflowing. You never had a dog? Cody said now. A bunch of my friends did, Rick said defensively. But he added, you? Got a collie now, looks just like Lassie. Had dogs all my life. All the dogs lined up with the platoon, which was broken up into 3 squads of 8 men each. The sergeant stood in front and announced, the first part of this course consists of basic dog training. Sit, stay, heel, down, and come. U-Haul met every cliche of a sergeant. He was big, mean, loud, and insulting. He acted a lot the way the sergeant during basic training had. Rick wondered if they'd all watched the training film on how to act like a big, mean, loud, insulting sergeant. In the advanced infantry training Rick had gone through just before dog training, the Sarge didn't insult them. County basic, AIT, and now dog training, Rick figured he might end up spending as much time training as fighting. Are you listening, soldier? U-Haul was staring straight at him. Rick said, yes, sir. That had slipped out. He knew exactly what U-Haul would answer. U-Haul put his face a few inches from Rick's. I work for a living. Don't ever call me sir again. Yes, Sergeant. U-Haul stomped down the row. You are the boss, men, he shouted. Do not take anything from your dog. You are in control. Your dog is eager to please you, for that is a dog's mission in life. Don't ever give your dog treats. Rick's eyes flicked down toward Cracker as though she might give him away. Your dog works for the love of man, not for the love of food. He looked right at Rick as if he knew Rick had given Cracker hot dogs. Rick didn't change expressions, and the Sarge continued. The basis of all of our training is obedience and the bond between man and dog. At the end of training, the best handlers receive trophies. Starting that day, and for day after day after day, all they ever did, it seemed to Cracker, was sit, stay, and heel in every direction, including in circles. Sometimes she knew what Rick was going to say before he spoke, so she did it before he asked, and he would pull at her neck and say no. Then he would tell her to do what she'd just done. She figured he was kind of mixed up that way. Sometimes she did something totally different from what he just asked to annoy her. Rick found that Cody was right. that Cracker obviously had learned all this earlier. Still, after a while, whenever Rick told her to sit, she sometimes liked to glare at him first, then sit. Rick figured this was to let him know that she understood the power of the chain around her neck, but he had better understand that she knew the chain was the only reason she needed to listen to him. If she hesitated too long, he'd jerk the chain and say, "No, sit," and she'd sit, but with a glare in her eyes. One morning in formation, she simply refused to sit. The entire platoon watched as Rick said over and over, "No, sit," and pulled at her chain. Some guys were even laughing. Finally, he had to simultaneously push her butt down as hard as he could while pulling up on the chain until she sat. She looked straight ahead. No way was he going to look at the sergeant. But he thought, "I hate that man for assigning me this dog." Rick had never hated anyone in his life. Every community had a couple of cranks who were just what they were, and you accepted that, but you didn't hate them. This was hate. Sarge came up to him as if reading his mind and said almost happily, "That's the most impressive example of incompetence I've seen in my entire career in the Army." He turned to the other men. Healing was also another problem. Half the time, Rick was dragging Cracker, or else she was pulling him. Meanwhile, Bruno walked obediently at the side of Cody. Tristy was the same. Perfect. Rick had just gotten the wrong dog. That was the problem. This was the first dog he'd ever met who didn't seem crazy about him. "I'm on to your ways," he said to her one morning. Whenever he lost his temper, his parents always tried to reason with him. Maybe that would work with the dog. "You're just like me." No tact and diplomacy because you think this is all unfair, right? She looked at him without expression. They just weren't bonding at all. He took a breath and said, "All right, then come," she said. After a while, the dogs learned other commands at the obstacle course, like crawl and hup, which was the command used for both jump and up and jump down. Sometimes, when Rick said hup, Cracker ran around the obstacle instead of over it. Other times, she did it perfectly. In the meantime, the squad moved on to hand signals, and dogs started to work more like teammates with their handlers. Rick and Cracker weren't the worst team in the squad, but they definitely were in the bottom 5 to 10%. At night, if she bothered to think about it at all, Cracker would lie next to Tristy, and she would know that things weren't going well, but she didn't know what the result of it would be. At Willie's once, when she'd scratched a couch cover, Willie's parents made her stay outside for an hour, and she knew it was an hour because Willie's father had kept shouting over and over, "An hour outside, an hour outside." Anyway, even if she now kind of had a human who kind of seemed like he was hers, she also now knew that people just abandoned you eventually. It had already happened to her twice, so why listen to them? Why do what they say? As for Rick, he would lie on his cot thinking about the day's various failures. His ego was taking quite a beating. All Rick could do was hold his head high the way he had been taught. One night, after an especially bad day of training, Rick lay in bed fuming and couldn't sleep. You all had told him that they might cycle Cracker out or give her to another handler if they wanted her, if any wanted her. Cycling out could mean anything. It could mean returning her to civilian life. It could mean giving her to another handler. It could mean sending her to sentry training. And it could mean putting her down. Sarge said he didn't know what would become of her if she was cycled out. Rick lay thinking about changing dogs and leaving Cracker to her fate. It wasn't personal against the dog or anything, but after all, the dog could save his life once he got in Vietnam. The wrong dog could get him killed. The only thing that was stopping him from letting Cracker go was when he thought about the 2 letters he'd already received from the boy who'd previously owned Cracker. Both letters asked if Cracker was the best dog in training, and both talked about how much he still loved her. The boy claimed he taught Cracker 90 words, and Cody, who had told Rick he thought she was a great dog. But dang it, Rick hated being one of the worst teams in class. Rick swung up from his cot and walked outside into the mild night air. In the distance, he saw some guys standing by a Jeep. Fort Benning was mostly quiet at night, but some work had to be done at all hours. He jogged up to the Jeep. Say, you guys heading toward the kennels? Yeah. Need a lift? Thanks, man. They drove quietly. When they arrived, one of the guys said, We're returning in an hour. Need a lift back? You guys are lifesavers. Cool. See you then. Cracker knew Rick was coming before he got there. She didn't move from her plywood bed, though. She felt kind of wary. This could be something bad. When he got to the gate, he softly called, Cracker, but she still didn't move. And she could smell that he hadn't brought a hot dog. He opened the gate and said, Cracker, come. She didn't move. It gave her pleasure not to move when he called. He leaned his head against the kennel and didn't have a thought in the world about what he should do next. He didn't even understand why he'd come. Then he walked inside and knelt down next to her plywood bed. I don't know, he said. I don't know what to do. You tell me. She didn't move. He reached out to rub her head. Gosh, she was beautiful, a beautiful animal. Maybe the best looking dog in training. And the boy had claimed he'd taught her 90 words. She had to be smart if that was true. He looked around. The other dogs were stirring, and a couple of them had barked at him. Cracker, he said, does it make a difference if you die without applying yourself? Like, if you're dead, you're gone. So what's the difference if you applied yourself or not? Cracker just looked at him. She didn't know what any of those words meant except dead. Willie had taught her that when she found the dead bird. He also taught her to play dead. Is that what Rick wanted? What am I talking to a dog? Why am I talking to a dog at 2 a.m? Rick said. He must have lost his mind. Sometimes when Rick watched 2020 and Tristy or Cody and Bruno working together, he felt a real thrill. Those dogs were amazing, 2020 said. If you read the literature, you'll find that for all intensive purposes, dogs can smell through concrete. Rick knew the phrase was supposed to be for all intents and purposes, but he never said anything because it was 2020's favorite phrase. Apparently, dogs' noses opened up a whole new world that didn't exist to humans. But Rick just couldn't see anything special in Cracker. She was just a big ball of hair. Rick led her out of the kennel, and she was off, disappearing behind the building. Hey, come back here. Come, come. He heard a lot of barking from all the dogs he'd woken with his cries. But instead of chasing Cracker, the frustration of dealing with her rose in him, and he shouted with fury, Do whatever you want. You're dead meat once you cycle out. They can put you down for all I care. Then he sat down and held his head in his hands. He inhaled deeply, and when he did, it was as if he were inhaling guilt over what he just said. He realized he already kind of liked the insane dog, already felt some kind of connection with her. He didn't want her to be put down or given to some sentry program, but he didn't want to get killed in the Vietnam War either. Rick started as he felt something cold and wet on his hand. He looked up, and there she was. The dim light caught the cat-like reflectiveness in her eyes. For a second, those eyes seemed to bore into him, and even through him. Man, she was a beaut. What am I going to do with you, he asked, stepping back down a touch, making the reflectiveness disappear. She threw down her paws to play. He said, Cracker, come. And to his surprise, she did. She followed him to a grove of trees. He pointed to one. Tree, he said. He pointed to another. Tree, he said. Cracker already knew what a tree was. She didn't know whether he was trying to tell her what one was or whether he was asking her because maybe he didn't know. Then he started running back and forth between the two trees, all the while shouting, Run, run between the trees. She looked around. It could be that he was crazy. She had seen a crazy man when she lived in Chicago. He lived in a different alley from where she lived, but Willie had told her he was crazy. Then Rick pointed at yet another tree and said, Cracker, run to the tree. And then she got it. She ran to the tree and looked back at him. He cried out, Good girl. And he pointed to another tree and said, Run to the tree. And She ran to the tree. Good girl! Then he directed her to run among a whole bunch of trees. And they heeled, sat down, lay down, and did every single thing they'd been working on for weeks. When they finished, she was panting, but felt elated. Rick felt elated too. He was also panting. He threw his arms around her. Good girl, he said. Good girl. And for the first time since had ever said it, she knew he meant it. It made her feel wonderful. Rick kenneled her and caught her ride back. Geez, he couldn't believe this dog could have been put down. After that night, training got better and better. In fact, Rick started lying in bed thinking about the day's triumphs instead of the day's failures. It didn't happen all at once, but after a while, it seemed to Rick that they were in maybe the top 25% of the class. Not that this trophy business meant anything. They were all in this together. There was nothing wrong with being the best. Every day, the instructor told the men the same thing. When you get to Vietnam, you'll do everything with your dog. Don't take a leak without your dog. Don't have a smoke without your dog. If you sneeze, I want your dog at your side. In Vietnam, entire companies of men will rely on your dog to save their lives. But your dog isn't working for those companies. Your dog is working for you. I want you to bond with that dog until you don't know where the dog ends and you begin. Rick had heard this 20 times already. Since that night running among the trees, he had started taking Cracker with him everywhere. It turned out she was a real people dog. She hated being alone, and he started feeling guilty when he did take a leak without her. Sometimes, even when he got leave and went into town, he would catch himself wondering what Cracker was doing. Training was actually starting to get fun. Sometimes the platoon would go out on the road and jog with their dogs heeling at their sides. If they ran into civilians, the civilians always wanted to take pictures. One hot day, they sweated down the road as a couple of gorgeous girls called out, "They're so cute." The sergeant halted the platoon so the girls could take pictures of the dogs. They gave all the guys new respect for their dogs. They were not only well-trained animals, but they were outstanding girl catchers. Other times when a civilian wanted to take pictures, the sergeant would rage, "These dogs are not pets. These are specialized military equipment." Rick noticed that some of the dogs weren't as good in various ways as Tristy, Bruno, and now Cracker. One dog refused to jump over a wall when told. Another dog bit his handler several times. That dog finally got cycled out and went to wherever such dogs went, maybe to Sentry, dog training. They liked the dogs meaner there. The more Rick trained, the more he started to feel that Cracker was reading his mind or something. Of course, he would never say that out loud, unless he wanted to be the laughingstock of the squad. In fact, when he first had the thought during formation one morning, he looked around self-consciously as if somebody might have read his mind. Rick saw you all scream at someone down the row and couldn't stifle a smile. Who couldn't stifle a yawn? Suddenly, the sergeant marched right in front of Rick. Rick's heart raced. You all had been looking another way, and Rick didn't see how he could have seen him yawn. "You bored, Private?" "No, Sergeant." No tact and diplomacy. "Is that correct, Private?" "Yes, Sergeant." "Went crying to your friend's buddy to get you into dog training school, did you, Private?" "I never cry, Sergeant." "You know how many dead men I've seen, Private?" Rick stopped a second. The guys didn't like to think about that aspect of the war, but the sergeants liked to remind them. "No, Sergeant," Rick said more quietly. Sarge spoke quietly. 207. I keep a record. Rick didn't answer. 50 push-ups, Private, and don't ever yawn in front of me again. If you yawn at the wrong time in Vietnam, you'll be a dead man. Understand what I'm saying, Private?" "Yes, Sergeant." Rick dropped to the ground and executed 50 perfect push-ups, while the other men left to run their dogs down the road. Cracker sat patiently, and when Rick was finished, he could swear that dog was laughing at him.